Hello, everyone. Today, we're taking you inside a recent event we hosted here at CSIS, focused on something that quietly underpins almost every policy debate in the country, America's federal statistical system. Now, I can imagine some of you are asking, why would a national security think tank host an event on federal statistics? The answer is quite simple. America cannot afford to shoot in the dark. Federal economic statistics are not a technical afterthought. They're literally the operating system of the U.S. economy. They tell us which regions are attracting investment, where supply chains are exposed, how we stack up against our competitors. They help companies decide where to build a semiconductor fab, a data center, or a manufacturing hub. They also help lenders make decisions, state and local governments, and innovators about opportunities that otherwise would be lost. And yet, at the very moment we need this system the most, it's under real strain. Budgets are flat, IT infrastructure is aging, and survey response rates are falling. Most of all, revisions to data are often weaponized for political ends. And so that's why my colleagues and I convened leaders from government, industry, and the data community to shine a light on the role of federal statistics and their importance in this current age of economic security. I'm Naveen Girishankar, and welcome to this special edition of Betting on America. From the founding of the Republic, the architects of our economy were also the builders of our statistical system. Madison, Gallatin, Kuznets, they all made generational investments in the statistical system, often in response to grand national challenges, such as industrialization, the Second World War, the Cold War. That legacy is now our duty. A recurring theme you'll hear throughout the conversations in this episode is the importance of both integrity and innovation, the two pistons of the American statistical machine. Both of these are now under pressure. You'll also hear that despite our polarized politics, there is broad consensus that the United States should focus on building the statistical system that we need for the future, not just preserving the one that we have today. And so I invite you to listen first to this conversation with Mark Calabria, Chief Statistician of the United States. Hello, everyone. Okay, we're on to the next segment of the morning program. I am absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Mark Calabria, who is the Chief Statistician of the United States. Thank you so much for taking the time. You have an immensely busy schedule, and so lots of questions for you, but you've had an extensive parkour across U.S. government, many different roles. And in your current role as Chief Statistician, I wanted to get started by asking you how you would describe the priorities of the administration when it comes to statistics at this moment in time. So.
Great. Well, maybe before I describe the priorities, let me do the disclaimer of everything I'm going to say is just my own.
Okay.
So don't take anything.
All right.
May or may not overlap.
Understood.
So first and foremost, again, some of this was touched on the previous panel. I think what we need to focus on first and foremost is long-term decline in response rates.
Mm-hmm.
How do you turn that around? Mm-hmm. In the short run, we need to focus on the seasonality issues. As you know, a number of series, for instance, may have a 5-year cycle, so we still have got 2020 and 2021 entering into the seasonality, and I think it's fair to say that 2020 was weird in terms of data seasonality. Now, the plus is eventually that will roll off, but in the next couple of years, how do we deal with that seasonality issue before we get back to sort of a steady state? So that's fixable, but I think it's having a really big impact in day to day. And then, of course, data security, which I know we'll talk about, extensively. And this, again, is one of the things that, to me, keeps me, up and really focused on how do we, again, I think it gets back to response rates in one way, in that, people are going to be more reluctant to respond if they don't believe that their data is going to be secure and protected. And of course, I'm, a very big privacy advocate, and I want to make sure that whatever we do collect does not get hacked or breached, or that people feel confident that the data that they give the government is not going to be shared in ways that they haven't consented to.
One of the things that we've been talking about is how the economy is changing in profound ways. One version of that is that multiple technology revolutions,
We're now in the midst of whatever the root causes of it is, a major upheaval in the trading system. We have some form of economic dislocation over many decades. And obviously you, in your previous role as chief economist to Vice President Pence, would have been viewing this from that perch. Now you're sitting here, you have to also think about the 100 or so statistical agencies that are under your purview across the federal government. How is the economy fundamentally changing in your view? And what pressure does that place on the statistical system that we have inherited?
So, just as we moved at one time from predominantly agriculture to manufacturing, we have obviously the last few decades been moving from a manufacturing to a services based. And obviously the output, I'm here in Washington, and I'll say, I don't know how you measure the output of a lobbyist, for instance. But we know how to manufacture the output of a plant. And so as we continue that direction of a service-based economy, things like professional services and value add in professional services, I think become much more difficult to truly measure, especially in terms of productivity relative to manufacturing. But again, we did go through a phase in our history where we transitioned from measuring agriculture output predominantly to measuring factory output, just as we went through a phase where, telephones became a thing and people stopped going as much door and you called people up on the phone. So there's always technological change that goes on in terms of how you reach out to people and how you measure the economy. To some extent, statistics are always going to be a lagging indicator as we learn what sectors of the economy look different and how you think about, again, value added productivity. Those are going to be a really big change as we move. And of course, you have much more international based systems. So and getting back to making sure that these are statistics that relate to policy questions that policymakers have, right, such as on the trade front, which I know something is deep interest here. Mm-hmm. So again, trying to make sure that you're dealing with that aspect of it, and then also dealing with the data technology as well. So, maybe it'll date me to say that there have certainly been points of my career last probably 10 or so years where I've sort of said, can't I just have a mainframe in the basement? Why does everything have to be in the cloud? How do I think about the data vulnerability there? Obviously, we're not going back. But again, as you make these trade-offs between data being more and more accessible, you also make it more and more hackable. So how do you kind of have that balance where you're bringing data security at the same time you are trying to make those data sets I can remember, doing my dissertation where I went down to the basement and, entered into a terminal and wrote my own code off of big data tape that was running in another room. We don't do that today. You download a data set, you can run it on your phone even sometimes. So again, how that technology is changing, how that accessibility, but it gets important to the fact that, in a sense, we've democratized access to data in a much bigger way. And so again, I'm always astounded when I go back and read, economics or just, empirical articles from, say the 1950s and having to imagine what somebody went through just to run that regression.
Yeah. Abacus, maybe.
Absolutely, maybe. Right.
Let me shift gears for a second. I've heard you talk about trust and the importance of trust in the system. I look at it in two ways. So let's maybe take up those two things. One is privacy. Shed some light on how you think about that. You alluded to that at the beginning, and then I have another trust question to ask you.
Yeah, and people rightly, I think, have an expectation that if they share their data, and it's interesting, I'll say as an aside, one of my other jobs I'm doing now, I guess we didn't mention at the beginning, the chief statistician is one of my 3 jobs I'm currently working, which I guess is the normal now in Washington, is to have multiple jobs. The other thing I spend most of my day at is working at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau on an open banking, open data rule that we're engaging in. And when people give their account data to a bank, they want that protected. Right. When you give your data to the government in a survey or when you pay your taxes, you want that data protected. Now, I think I have a little bit of unique vantage given that all of my OPM data was hacked by China, so I have no privacy. Probably not the only one in the room who's experienced that. But how do you make sure that when you are collecting the data, what's being shared between agencies? So a really good example of this is, the Census Bureau and BEA have worked out a relationship with data sharing with IRS. BLS is not. And obviously IRS brings very legitimate concerns that if we share this tax data with other agencies, how are we confident that it's protected?
Right.
And that's a very legitimate concern, but how do you make sure that other agencies are creating those data standards? And of course, you've seen, I do think that dealing with the issue of data security. Now, part of this as well is also taking a perspective, which I know researchers might not love. Let's not ask sensitive private questions unless we need to. So the first question for data privacy should be, do we need to ask this question? Do we need to collect data on this issue? And I think that we don't do that enough. There is a sense of more data is better. There's certainly lots of things about myself that I don't want the government to have in a database. I suspect that's true for most of us. So that has to be, to me, the first threshold. Should we be collecting this? And of course, first of all, channel my time from the Hill and remind myself, Congress did not create these statistical programs for the enjoyment purely of researchers. They created them for statutory purposes. So first and foremost, what are the data we need to collect to meet the statutory purposes that Congress has laid out? And how do we do that in a way where we protect the citizens and that their information? So A, what are you collecting? B, how are you storing it? C, how are you sharing it?
Yeah.
And those are all important qualifications. And again, it's interesting because across fields, whether it's the financial services or whether it's HIPAA and healthcare, we create all of these frameworks on how the private sector shares your personal data. I'm not convinced that we, the government, live up to those same standards on a daily basis that we expect of the private sector. And so part of my agenda is how do we get ourselves there where we can say that the federal government is first in class in protecting your data.
How far are we from that?
Well, let's say on a road 1 to 100, maybe we're about 60, maybe. So again, but you're just quantifying off the top of my head. So I think we have a ways to go. And certainly this is the public perception. So again, there are multiple reasons for long-run decline in response rates. But I do believe one of the many reasons is a sense of, I'm going to give my data to the government and it's not necessarily going to be secure. Yeah. So how do we address that as a fundamental issue?
Yeah, thank you for opining on that or sharing your perspective on that. The other trust issue, frankly, is the actions at BLS a few months ago raises questions and concerns about politicization. And I just wanted to give you the opportunity to share your perspective from where you sit on this. How do we preserve credibility of the system and the perception of the credibility of the system?
Sure. This is a fascinating topic that hits home to me. For those who don't know my background, the last important Supreme Court case over agency independence, Collins versus Yellen in 2001, that dealt with the Federal Housing Finance Agency, the person sitting in that seat at the time was me.
Right.
So, my job went to the Supreme Court. And despite my view that I helped successfully navigate the housing and mortgage market through the pandemic, the response was, you're fired. Right. So again, but that's politics, it's Washington. Right. And I think we have to understand that, everything in government is embedded in politics and is embedded in accountability. Right. There's no, this sort of statistical agents. First, let's start with, Census Bureau is not the Federal Reserve. So these kind of debates about independence and accountability, they're oranges and apples to some extent. What you have is wanting to make sure that the data gives you the right answer. And so go back to my earlier comment, certainly from my perspective, and I, again, mean this quite sincerely, I'm starting out with the premise of half of what I think is wrong. I don't know which half. So if I'm not interacting with the statistical system in a way, if I'm not talking to Vipin and Ron and they're not helping me get data to understand that, then I'm not eliminating what I think is wrong and increasing what I think is right. And so for me, you're simply not making good answers. And I think that's important in the public policy process is how do we get to good answers so that we know that the policies we're doing are actually effective. Yeah. And again, so I think that philosophy of I want the right answer. I don't want someone to just repeat back something to me or just, again, it's a waste of my time to engage in confirmation bias. I'll do that when I'm back at the private sector maybe. But again, as a policymaker, it's a waste of your time and you're not having an efficient impact because at the end of the day, all of the economic policies are really meant to grow the economy, grow opportunity. And if you if you're not regularly testing whether they're actually doing that, then you're not going to be effective.
Yeah. No, totally hear that. And by the way, I think you're probably an outlier when it comes to the population.
No, I mean, well, having worked on the Hill, I can certainly say the view of like, what does the data tell us is a very much minority view on Capitol Hill.
Right. I just offer this, which is, I think for many folks, independence, institutional independence gives the sense that, well, someone's checking to make sure that, you know, the process is robust and the output is robust. I guess the question is, how does one do that in the current?
I think part of the tension, and I recognize within the statistical community, you know, the use of independence, I think means something different. You know, again, you know, I come from more of a financial services background where we talk about the Federal Reserve, or we talk about, you know, again, one of my jobs is CFPB, which was one of the other big independence cases. So I think there's a bit of an orange and apple, and I think it kind of confuses the debate. It's also important to ask, you know, there's always that kind of silent independence from whom? I mean, I don't want to, you know, to state the banal, no social, no government institution exists in a vacuum. They all exist in a web of social relationships. So the question really fundamentally is independence from whom? Mm-hmm. Do you mean independence from the political system, from elected representatives? Because again, nobody's ever truly independent. Mm-hmm. And so again, to me, I worry that some of this sounds like independence from my party, not from the other party. Right. Our independence from these institutions are the purview of the elite, and therefore the public should not have a view. Yeah. And again, so I do worry that the use of the word independence implies and leads up to sort of an in-group, out-group dynamic, which I think is unhelpful for strengthening the broad public acceptance of these agencies over time. Yeah. Like again, not to get on too much of a rabbit hole, but as I said, one of my day jobs is at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Yeah. That has been a fight about that agency's independence for years. Yeah. I think it would be tragic to turn the Census Bureau into as polarizing a figure as what the CFPB has become. It would be extremely damaging for census. So my recommendation when we have these independence debates is keep in mind they're loaded. There's a lot of baggage, and there's a lot of implications to it, and let's not go down that world because I think it's been extremely destructive in the financial services world. So let's not repeat that. Yeah. And at the end of the day, how do you make sure that these statistical agencies have broad, bipartisan, across the spectrum support, and that they're seen as credible and not speaking for one party or the other? Because again, I don't want data that backs up whatever I already think. I want data that helps me understand what's going on in the world.
Yeah. One more topic to raise with you is the U.S. statistical system is the global benchmark in many ways. And I think you've talked about in the past the importance of setting global standards and U.S. leadership abroad. And, you know, I was describing earlier the way we think about economic security and its importance for growth, for the security of assets and markets, but importantly, global influence. So what are you doing on that front?
Well, and I'll say almost say, I mean, especially probably the preeminent global issue right now is trade. And how do we bring additional statistics to bear? So it's often the case that, you know, as we say, you end up counting what counts. And so there's nowhere is this better illustrated than the focus on tariffs, for instance. We can measure tariffs, we know tariffs. What's a lot harder to measure, but equally important, is non-tariff trade barriers, for instance. So how can we bring more statistical power to bear? And I know there's been lots of work on this. The World Bank has done, made a great effort. But again, I think we're just in kind of the infancy of understanding the quantification of non-tariff trade barriers. How do we understand subsidies? So, you know, part of my career has been working on issues around Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and there have been tremendous work, you know, Deb Lucas at MIT, for instance, has done a lot of work on quantifying the subsidies that have gone to Fannie and Freddie. Well, how do we quantify the subsidies that go to Chinese steel manufacturers? How do we get a better sense of what these non-tariff trade barriers are? And we really can't, you know, fundamentally address them unless we have a better quantification of them and a better understanding. So in some sense, trade has gotten more complicated because there's so much non-tariff activity goes on. Yet, you know, so much of the conversation is what we can measure. But I do want to make the argument we need to do a much better job at measuring the harder parts of trade, because those really are some of the fundamental barriers. You know, I worked on some of the Japan deal we did in the first term, and so much of our trade relationship with Japan are non-tariff trade barriers. So, you know, especially on the food side. You know, and the ability to export potatoes or rice or beef to Japan has been historically very difficult for a number of reasons. And so again, how do you get some measurement around these things? Because if you don't get measurement, ultimately how do you get enforcement? How do you get the credibility of these
Yeah.
trade agreements unless people could know? Or, one of the probably most fundamental debates the first term around NAFTA and USMCA was rules of origin. How do you measure how much of a car being assembled in Mexico is actually electronics from China? So, again, trying to get those things measured, the supply chain. And of course, the pandemic brought supply chain issues to the forefront in a very big way, but they're fundamental to, I think, the trade conversation and getting more and better data there. And I know that Vipin and everybody at BEA is doing, I think, a terrific job on the international front to get us better data and a better understanding. But again, fundamentally, I just want to repeat the theme of, for us to be able to know that the policies we're implementing are effective, we have to have better data, we have to have accurate data, and that's what we're trying to achieve.
That's such a powerful point. And in fact, the theme of this is federal statistics and economic security. And when you think of the broad panoply of economic security issues, trade restrictions with export controls, investment screening of various kinds, I can imagine a whole research agenda and data development agenda around these topics that could serve the next generation of American policymakers. So I think, what you're saying there resonates very strongly.
I mean, for good or bad, we count what we can count, if you will. And so how do we bring more and more factors that have not been counted or weighed, into that quantitative situation? Obviously, you need to be cautious of always recognizing that just because you can't quantify something doesn't mean it's not important.
Right.
But again, having been in Washington for a long time in these debates, people do immediately go to what they can quantify.
Right.
And so the pressure there is, the better the informed the debate, part of that margin has to be quantifying more aspects of it.
And it shapes the lexicon of how we talk about modern life.
Absolutely. And I think it does give us, a better understanding. And it does, it's easy, there's always a vein of complaining about the present. And as somebody who's a little bit of a statistics geek, I loved Robert Gordon's book when you go back and look at these massive time series and, what did life look like in 1900? Unless you've got that data where you can go back. And I think it does give you a great appreciation of the progress we've made.
Yeah.
And again, so I think it helps you ground your current experience in what the historical trends have been. So again, I'm a big advocate of the data, and I think what I bring to this perspective is, that of a user.
Mark, this has been phenomenal. Thank you. You've been so generous with your time and your insights, and I just want to, everyone should applaud Mark for coming and.
Thank you. I appreciate the conversation.
That was the first of many rich conversations we had during our Federal Statistics and Economic Security event here at CSIS. Next, you'll hear from Oliver Wise, former Chief Data Officer at the Department of Commerce, and Rachel Lingas, former Chief Sanctions Economist at the U.S. Treasury, on how the federal statistical system underpins economic security and where that system is currently falling short. Then you'll hear from David McNellis, Managing Director for Global Macro and Asset Allocation at KKR, on how statistical capabilities influence his firm's global investment decisions. And we'll close with insights from Bill Wyatrowski of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Ron Jarman of the Census Bureau, and Vipin Arora of the Bureau of Economic Analysis on how they think about safeguarding credibility and public trust at their agencies.
I think it's completely appropriate that federal statistics and the federal data ecosystem be discussed within the context of national security and economic security. I think it rarely is, but I think especially in the mid-21st century, that's entirely appropriate and apt. And I think what the public knows federal statistics for is we use it, perfect markets require perfect information, and it's the federal government's role to put forward as perfect information as possible so that those markets can function well. So there's that fundamental role, that infrastructural role that federal statistics plays in that environment. But in the world of competition, geopolitical competition, which when you're in the federal statistical system, you can't really say because the federal statistical system needs to be policy agnostic, but now that I'm not there, I can say it. We certainly are in. The domains of that competition are principally technological, and whatever country out-innovates the other their worldview and will dominate in that geopolitical order. And the federal data system, of which the statistical system is the capstone of, is an under-leveraged but extremely important asset in promoting innovation. So in addition to better decision-making, better policy decision-making, and better understanding how the economy works, that data that the federal statistical system ultimately shepherds and releases through very important data, statistical products is the biggest collection of economic and social data. And just the way federal environmental data is used to advance the earth sciences and meteorological sciences using AI, and that federal data on genomics, or that federally funded research that leads to genomics, has led to huge advances in how we understand biophysics, which is leading to discoveries in pharmaceuticals and understanding how diseases work. This is a hugely important tranche resource that can be used to better understand how the economy works. And if we use that data right, we can become much better at optimizing these trade-offs that economists do between inflation and employment, for example. And just as we use AI is now better really than the best Go players, it's better than the best biophysicists, it's better than the best radiologists, we should expect that a world in which they are better than the best economists. I hate to say in this room. But if we're going to be much better policymakers, we ought to be able to apply these technologies to this incredible corpus of data.
When we talk about economic security data, I think that fundamentally we're talking about something that the US government statistical system, as excellent as it is really not built to handle. We're talking about often dealing with international data, questions that have international ramifications. We're talking about who depends on whom and how quickly systems can adapt under geopolitical stress. And while our statistical agencies are really excellent at measuring economic flows like trade, investment, and prices, they're not really designed for things like mapping vulnerabilities or choke points or exposure to coercive policies of our economic competitors. So framing this very simply in terms of where I see the core gaps for economic security decision-making is one around elasticities. So, and looking at this at across different sectors. So in a crisis, policymakers need to know how much production can shift, how quickly, how we can substitute inputs, and what sort of price responses we can expect from those. So oftentimes we're coming up with those numbers based on kind of what we see in academic literature, and there's only certain sectors where this is actually studied, like energy, crude oil prices. But as we know, or at least as I learned after kind of diving into energy statistics in a lot more detail, it's really variable based on what type of oil you're producing, and the same could apply to different technology supply chains. But this is some fundamental data that's kind of needed to be at policymakers' fingertips to be able to then brief people and say, okay, this is kind of the price impact that we would expect from this kind of shock. And I think that's core information that they need to make decisions. Secondly, just harking back to my treasury background a little bit on financial flows. So oftentimes we're inferring risk through trade data. And it's kind of like an indirect measure of what's actually happening in terms of financial flows. So we don't have a lot of visibility into cross-border payments, things like trade invoicing, what currencies are being used. And the data that we do have is often too too slow in production for the kinds of like rapid decisions that policymakers need to make. So trade data on an international basis, often available on a month lag, like that is not enough time to really be able to inform decision making. And then more fundamentally, I'd say there's a governance issue here, like there's Commerce, Treasury, Department of Energy, Department of War, all see slices of this data, but kind of synthesizing that across agencies that all have different rules and standards and restrictions on data sharing is a very challenging problem that I think that we need to solve if we're going to be, if our government's going to adapt to the challenges that we currently face. And I'll pause there because I know we'll dig into more later.
Let's talk about India. That's an interesting example because so much of the development opportunity there is about the burgeoning of the consumer as it becomes more middle class and the development of the infrastructure there. There's no retail sales data in India. So we spend a lot of time looking at consumer opportunities where you just don't have the same information. And then on the infrastructure side, it was just a couple of years ago that the country started providing really good data on infrastructure investment. So what does that mean? Obviously, we do business there. In fact, if you have the scale to operate and the relationships, it becomes more of an opportunity than a problem. But I think it narrows the set of people who can operate in the country. In the U.S., there's been talk of this idea that there's more private equity funds than McDonald's, which is a pretty staggering statistic. It's not the case in Asia. It's a more constrained market. And the way that you end up doing business is you access private data and you have a network of executives within business that you can talk to and just give you a sense of what's going on. So the net effect of that is less liquidity in the capital markets. And then like throughout South and Southeast Asia, I'd estimate that credit spreads tend to be about 100 to 200 basis points wider on an apples to apples basis for credit quality. And so that's really how it manifests. Is cost of capital is higher.
I think there's so much for the public to learn about what you're actually doing, and I wonder how much of that, organizations like ours or others should be able to bring that to light, and you yourselves, what you're doing about that, because otherwise you're caught in a moment where the politics and the credibility of the institution is questioned, but in fact under the like the duck paddling under the water, there's all this stuff happening. What's your perspective on that, particularly around the notion of credibility versus independence versus the kinds of things Mark Calabria was talking about?
So there's certainly been a fair amount of misstatements, and I think BLS has been in the crosshairs on a lot of that, and it's not new. So, I do an introductory session for brand new BLS staff, and I show a video from 15 or so years ago that talked about the Obama administration cooking the books. And that wasn't true then, it's not true now, but there's certainly a lot of misstatements about cooking the books, about sort of adding politics into the data. We're a bunch of math nerds, and we rely on our methodology, and we feel very strongly about making that methodology as transparent as we possibly can. And I can give you other examples. Even recently, with the shutdown, there were individuals who were certain that I had the unemployment data in my back pocket and that I wasn't releasing it because it was going to make somebody look bad. And I can assure you, I have no idea what the September unemployment data are. And so getting past those misconceptions is something that all of us could work on.
Ron?
Yeah, I agree. I don't think people, have a good enough sense of how the sausage gets made and how, it would be difficult to do some of the things that, people out in the public arena sometimes think is happening. But I would also say we need to do more to, especially for sort of the public at large is to do things that they see direct value from. And so, one of the things that we worry about with declining response rates is that, there could be many reasons. I think the main reason is people just don't have the time, and they get lots of requests for surveys and what have you. But if they see that there's some value from participating in these things that's more direct to them, perhaps they would have a different attitude about engaging with the statistical system. And
Dip, your thoughts on this?
So one of the questions that I get, when I get a chance to speak to just the general public audience is who gets to see GDP before it's published? Always can guarantee that that's going to be a question that comes out of the audience. And so it's nice to be able to talk through the processes we have and the segmentation we have and bringing all this stuff together, because for decades we've been doing this, and the process it's very secure, and not many people, that's the answer. People seem to be very comforted by that. And I think just in general, that kind of communication, I'll say key to me to credibility is plain language communication. And it's got to be plain language communication, whether it's in your methodology documents or whether it's me up here, or Ron up here, or Bill up here talking about it. I mean, I know Adam Szyminski's in here somewhere, just a master when he was the administrator of EIA in plain language communication. And I learned a lot from him, and I think following that model would be very effective for us in terms of credibility.
Thanks for listening to this special episode of Betting on America, which covers just a portion of what we discussed at our Federal Statistics and Economic Security Workshop. You can watch this full event on our website, and you can find this episode and more on csis.org, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This is Naveen Girishankar reminding you that everyone has a role to play in winning the tech race.